Hello and welcome to Inclusion Dialogue, a podcast where we discuss everything related to inclusive education and diversity in the classroom. My name is Joanne Banks and I'm a lecturer in Trinity College Dublin in the School of Education. This podcast consists of interviews between me and leading academics from all over the world where we discuss how we define inclusive and special education. We look at the difference between theory and practice and what inclusion looks like on the ground in our schools. I began this project for my students, and it was to allow them to hear the views of researchers that I was getting them to read in the form of journal articles and research reports. I've been pretty overwhelmed by the response though, and I think as the podcast has grown, it will be of a much broader appeal to other academics, to policymakers, to educators and practitioners, to parents, but also to students themselves. My guest this week is Professor Sheila Riddell. Sheila is from the University of Edinburgh and she's been a key figure in inclusive education research in Scotland and Europe over the past number of decades. I'm a big fan of Sheila's work as she's one of the few academics focusing on the relationship between students with disabilities and other social characteristics such as their social class, gender or their ethnicity. She finishes our discussion with an insight into her more recent work on the social justice and inclusion agenda. Okay, Sheila, thank you so much for meeting with me this morning. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you giving up the time. Sheila, I really wanted to talk to you because your area of work is something that I've followed and I'm hugely interested in throughout my career to date. So I really am interested to hear your views about kind of the questions that I'm asking different academics in the field about how we interpret inclusive education, our conceptual understandings of it, but also the research base, the evidence base underneath it, and what that's showing. But I suppose maybe could we start with me asking you, like, how did you end up working in this area? How did you end up working in inclusive ed?
Well, I think my interest in it started when I was working in a comprehensive school. That was right at the start of my working life. I did a degree in English and then got a job as a teacher of English. And obviously then you're working, it was actually a mixed ability English class I was teaching at quite a progressive comprehensive school. And so I had to teach kids, some of whom were going to university and some of whom hadn't learned to read or write in the same class, right up to the age of 16. So this was really a challenge. And in those days, there was no learning support. So you had to do it all by yourself. So I figured out all sorts of ways of differentiating learning. But I think I was always a little bit dissatisfied with I really felt that the kids who were struggling with reading and writing were not getting enough help because always the pressure was coming from the young people and the parents who wanted them to be stretched at the higher end. But I did enjoy that, and I was aware that we needed much more learning support than was available in the early, I suppose, late 70s, early 80s in schools. The idea of the classroom assistant was unheard of in those days. So then I actually did a PhD at Bristol University, and the topic of that was gender and option choice. And I was very interested in the interactions of gender and social class and how kids were generally quite compliant in terms of going along fairly traditional gender lines. And I actually found that middle class parents were probably more willing to challenge these gender divisions than people from less advantaged backgrounds. So that was an intriguing finding. So I realised at that point that you couldn't just look at one variable. You always had to look at the interactions between these divisions. But at that point, disability wasn't particularly part of the focus. So then my next move was actually to Scotland after doing the PhD at Bristol. I was living in rural Dorset with no job opportunities. So I moved to Edinburgh, which was a fairly big move. And I got a job working at Edinburgh University looking at the impact of the post-Warnock legislation in Scotland.
Okay.
And it was only a research fellow job for a year. But I had the job of pulling together a research project, a big one, funded by the Scottish office in those days, that had kind of gone a bit awry. It had run over time and got the findings. So I managed to pull everything together, and the effect of that was that I kind of thought, this is such an interesting area. I really want to carry on working in this area. So, but putting it together with the other things that interest me at that point, gender and social class, but also, of course, ethnicity is part of that mix as well. Although, in Scotland, we haven't got a huge non-white population, and certainly in rural Dorset in those days, it was a relatively homogenous white population. But I've always been aware that you can never leave that out as well. So since then, I would say that most of my work has been about, well, additional support needs as it became in Scotland, and its link with other social variables. And there are endless things to look at in that area, I think. So I can talk about the more recent work I've done, but maybe I should pause at that point.
Yeah, can I ask, before we come up to more recent work that you're involved in, for those that don't know it, a post-Warnock Scotland, what did it look like?
Well, of course, Warnock, the Warnock report was common. It applied across the piece. And so I think Warnock is indeed a watershed, because she said we shouldn't be talking about children's deficiencies and deficits. We should be talking about their needs. And many practitioners were actually doing that already. But what she said really struck a chord. She, at one level, wanted to get rid of labels altogether, but of course the labels were very difficult to get rid of and never really disappeared, and subsequently, I would say, re-emerged quite strongly. But I think she was clearly pushing for more mainstream education, less segregation, and also in those days she talked about partnership with parents, which was placing parents in a particular position relative to having rights. And she certainly wasn't saying very much about children's rights at that point. So the rights agenda wasn't very strong in Warnock. But nonetheless, it made a big difference. Of course, another theme of the Warnock report was the need for much closer multidisciplinary working. So working with health, education and social work. And again, it's interesting that everybody pays lip service to that, but there's still a very long way to go in terms of achieving that goal, I think.
Yeah. And internationally, certainly from an Irish perspective, we would often refer to Scotland, and I'm sure you're probably sick of people saying this to you about the Scottish context, but, you know, as being quite progressive. There's a kind of a shift in language over the years. You know, there's quite a bit of research, most of it carried out by yourself in the area, for example. Do you agree that that has happened? Is it more progressive perhaps than its neighbours? And why is that?
Okay, well, I think we have to be, when you live in a country, as you know from Ireland, you're always very aware of the imperfections and where the rhetoric and the reality don't quite tally. So I think we shouldn't really idealise Scotland, but we should recognise the good things.
Sure.
And I would say that one of the things that Scotland does have is a comprehensive school system that really it crosses the board. We do have 6% approximately of children in fee-paying private education. And I would say that's one feature of the Scottish education system that is deeply non-inclusive. Because even though those schools aren't allowed to discriminate, they are allowed to discriminate on the grounds of academic ability. So no child with a learning disability would get into a school like that. Of course, some children with dyslexia would if they could meet the academic standards. But that's a bit of Scottish education that's never examined. So I just park that there. That's one example of where it hasn't really, I think, got it entirely right. on the plus side, the comprehensive schools do include all children. We have a very small proportion of children in special schools and units. I think it's about less than 1%.
Wow.
That would probably be like Ireland, I'm not sure. But really, the vast majority of children are in comprehensive schools. Of course, some comprehensive schools are more inclusive than others. There's still a neighbourhood effect, which is quite large. And I think that the comprehensive schools have got better, I would say. I mean, I was talking about my early experience in Dorset, where, as a teacher of English, where there wasn't even any learning support. I mean, now every school in England and in Scotland would have units that were very well equipped, learning support teachers and classroom assistants who work closely with mainstream teachers and children who spend some of their time maybe in mainstream and getting one-to-one support. So that is an absolute transformation of the system. And actually, I'm very aware that it couldn't have happened without quite a big investment in classroom assistants as well as learning support teachers. But just because when I was running mixed ability, it was me alone with the class. Whereas now, if you've got a class with different abilities in it, kids working at very, very different levels, you'll almost inevitably have a classroom assistant there, or more than one classroom assistant, and a learning support teacher as backup. It's not the one classroom teacher expected to do it just by him or herself.
And
there are still problems. So in Scotland, attainment is very closely linked to social class and actually to gender, but social class is by far the biggest variable associated with how you get on at school, your outcomes. So that is really a feature that I would say is quite worrying. And some features of social differentiation have intensified a bit over recent years. So, for example, in Scotland, it's now commonplace for some schools in middle-class areas to offer their kids 8 or even 9 subjects at National 5, which replace standard grade. It's the thing you do before hires. And in schools in less advantaged areas, kids are only allowed to do 4 or 5 subjects, which automatically means that if you want to be a doctor, for example, you probably can't do 3 sciences. So I would say this is reinforcing social class divisions. So it's not a perfect system. It could be a lot better with more social class mixing in schools. For me, an inclusive school is one that really caters for children from across the social class divisions, but also includes children with many different disabilities, learning difficulties, and also ethnicities. So I think that obviously there are wider social factors there as well, because we want schools also to cater for local communities, but there's a tension there because quite often you have some areas that are much more socially advantaged than others. So that's a conundrum, I think.
And our parents, do you need to send your child to your local school? Like, do parents move into areas in order to access a school? Like, are those patterns evident where parents actually physically move house in order to align their child with the local school?
I would say that yes, that does happen. So we do have school choice in Scotland, which is very similar to the policy in England. These policies developed in the 1980s. They were part of, the Thatcher changes that happened in the education system. And Scotland and England tended to leapfrog each other in pushing the school choice agenda. But the trouble is, in theory, that means that if you live in a less advantaged area, you should be able to choose a school for your child in a more socially advantaged area. But all of the schools give priority to children in their local catchment. So that means that they get in first, and then there may be no opportunity for other people, or very limited opportunity. So school choice policies theoretically are meant to give much greater choice to parents, and of course there are debates about this. They might have the potential to break down neighbourhood divisions, but they don't really in practice, I would say.
Yeah. And Sheila, like, maybe we'll just bring it up to some of the more recent current work that you're undertaking. Like, you know, we talked quite a bit about how, like, we know that disability can be a barrier, and you've mentioned disadvantage. Can you discuss maybe the intersection between, and you mentioned gender as well. So what has your more recent work found?
Well, I think my more recent work has, I mean, in some ways you'd like to come up with something entirely new, but really what we continue to find is the way in which these intersections occur and how difficult it is to actually make a difference. So it's very interesting to me that some types of difficulty, like, for example, specific learning difficulties, this may be a label that is actually sought after by parents for their children, because there are, well, for a start, there's a big stigma to having learning difficulties. Not being able to read or write in our society is stigmatizing and very damaging. But having dyslexia, I'm not saying there is no stigma associated with dyslexia, because there can be, but you're much more likely to get targeted help. You may get assistance with lower grades going into university. You get extra time in exams. There are many things like that. So some advantages accrue. And we do find that the social class divisions associated with dyslexia are very, very small. It's fairly balanced between different social groups. Whereas if you look at a category, you see we kept the categories of social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. A very high proportion of children in that group come from the most disadvantaged neighbourhoods, and there's a big preponderance of boys as well. And this is a label which is never or rarely chosen by parents. It's a very denigrating label, I suppose, and very often these are the children who are most likely to be excluded from school. Informal exclusion is quite a problem. So parents are advised just to take their children home, or only send them to school for half a day or something like that. So we do find it's very interesting that I think looking at the social divisions that are associated with different types of additional support needs, we do find that in almost every single category, there are significant differences, but the differences are much greater in these non-normative categories, where teachers decide or parents decide that they want that label attached to the child. If you look at the normative difficulties like sensory impairments, physical difficulties, progressive illnesses, and so on, which are measured against some sort of absolute scale, you find, well, they're low incidence for a start. There are very few of them. But I think that you would find very few social divisions there. It's almost equally divided between different social class groups, and also the gender differences are not so marked either. And I think that's absolutely intriguing, and we ought to be asking a lot about that. There is one point I want to make, actually, about Scotland, which is quite important. In 2004, Scotland shifted to additional support needs rather than special educational needs. It was another massive shift in terminology. Again, in an effort sort of to get rid of labels, but the labels never went. And additional support needs was meant to apply to a child who had difficulties for any reason whatsoever.
So if you the whole definition.
Whole spectrum. And there are some, I would say, quite controversial aspects there. So, for example, the European Commission has recommended that people from Roma backgrounds, gypsy travellers, that's the label that's used in Scotland, shouldn't automatically be identified as having special educational needs. But in Scotland, gypsy traveller is one of the, well, it's not gypsy traveller actually, it's interrupted learning, but that means gypsy traveller.
Yeah.
Interrupted learning is one of the additional support needs categories. So you could see that as being extremely problematic because it's putting the whole of an ethnic group
into
the additional support needs category. We've also got there are loads of labels, far more than in England, double the number. I think it's more than 24, and it keeps on expanding. And the expansion is often to do with pressure from a particular voluntary organisation that wants to get their particular category recognised. So we also have children who live with parents who have drug or alcohol abuse problems, children who may be at risk of abuse, any sort of child protection issues. And these are often social problems or indeed problems with parents rather than problems with children. So we also, bizarrely, I think, have more able children there as a category. It's a completely different sort of category, in which seems to be a very small category with boys outnumbering girls. But again,
is that socially differentiated, the gifted, the exceptionally able group?
Yes, there are more middle-class kids in that group. But I don't think that should be a category necessarily of additional support needs. I mean, I think certainly that schools should make sure that they have appropriate work, that they're able to provide extended learning for some children. But I don't think you necessarily need to include that as an additional support need label. So it's moved away from the learning disabilities, difficulties, conventional view. But I would say there are pros and cons. And we're moving to a situation now where every year a growing number of children in Scotland are identified as having additional support needs, more than a third of the population now. In some local authorities, it's getting up to 40% of the school population. And the assumption in the legal framework is that if you're identified as having additional support needs, the local authority is obliged to provide additional support. But that isn't happening. There's never been any research that looks at exactly what additional support these children are getting and whether it's doing any good or not.
In the main, what do they get? Is it additional hours of teaching?
Well, this brings me on to the next bit of the work that I've been doing, which is very much about children's rights, actually, which have often been forgotten in this whole area. And I think that there's always been a vagueness in Scotland about what additional resources you're going to get and what rights you have to claim additional resources. Local authorities like to insist that being identified with additional support needs doesn't automatically lead to extra resources. But that's the point of the label. That's what it says it's meant to do. And it's quite clear that some children are going to get fairly intensive additional resources, maybe the small number of children who have the low incidence, pretty significant disabilities. They may be in special schools and they're obviously going to have a lot more money spent on their education. But many children, I don't think, will get any more money spent on their education. In fact, it may lead to more stigmatising and a greater risk of being formally or informally excluded. So I think we ought to be cautious about seeing the expansion of additional support needs as automatically a good thing. I mean, people like Sally Tomlinson have talked about the dangers of the expansion of special education and the application of the label to a growing number of children, particularly boys from socially disadvantaged neighbourhoods. And I would say that's never really been taken on board in Scotland, because it suggests that growing levels of unemployment or underemployment are the fault of the child or young person, rather than something systemic to do with the lack of jobs. So I would be far more cautious and definitely not do what the Scottish Government does, which say, oh, isn't it great, we're identifying more children. Yeah.
And does the conversation ever move on to then a kind of a universal approach? So when there must be a tipping point, like you have a third in Ireland, our kind of prevalence rate is up around 25-28% children considered to have some kind of additional need in school. Does the conversation ever move then towards, okay, well, like a full inclusion model, where there's universal kind of design curriculum or whatever in school, so that there's no additional department where the resources are being fed into the mainstream?
Right. Well, no, I would say. But it's quite hard to imagine how that would work in practice. Because, I mean, for example, a child with some sort of autistic spectrum disorder may well be very academically able, but find it difficult to be in the mainstream class all the time, just because of the hubbub, the interactions and all that. You know, it may be overwhelming. So that child can only really be included in a mainstream school, I think, if there's a possibility for them to have some space in a separate context where they can get on with one-to-one support in a very calm, reduced interaction sort of environment. So, I mean, I can ask you a question. If this is being developed in Ireland, what does it actually mean in practice? Does it mean that you don't have learning support teachers or special units at all?
It's a real topic of debate, and it's probably one of the reasons why I started this podcast idea, is because it's currently under kind of consultation as to whether Ireland will adopt the New Brunswick model, the Canadian model of full inclusion. But Ireland is opening special classes, which are being applauded every year, over 100 classes per units attached to mainstream schools. And we still have a system of 120 something special schools. The idea behind the New Brunswick model, which was shown to us at various NCSE events in recent years, is that you would get kind of specialised support within school, within like resource mainstream provision, basically. But that the idea of a segregative unit or school would be gone. The removal of the language would be kind of the special education language would be taken out of kind of policy and legislation. And that I would only see it ever being successful on any level if initial teacher education and CPD were firmly embedded in any kind of funding model, because it would take, like, every aspect would need to be changed of the school system. It would need to be root and branch for it to be successful. So there's a huge kickback from advocacy organisations and parents about the loss of supports that they've really fought hard for, which is special educational needs assistance, classes themselves. So we're at a real crossroads at the moment in that debate, and there's certainly no clear answer as to how it works. New Brunswick presented it to us, but really small, huge political will and really small population. So there was a little bit of like excitement initially, and then like, okay, how would this actually work?
Yes,
the debate is still ongoing, you know.
Yeah, well, I would say, and I could be wrong about this, but it's not even being discussed in Scotland. I think the kickback from teachers, and probably from parents, and children's voices aren't really heard in any of this still, I think that there would be a load of resistance to that. And I would actually be quite suspicious, because we're moving into an era where there obviously, because of COVID, but also for us, because of Brexit, we are going to have big squeeze on resources in the future. And if you're talking removing existing provision, I would say that isn't a positive move at all. And I can't see how busy secondary could work for all children without some specialist support in place.
Sheila, I'm not going to longer, but is there anything that you would like to mention before I let you get back to your day? Is there anything else that you think we should cover?
Yeah. Okay, well, I meant to say more about this, and I realised I've only mentioned it once, but one of the big debates that I think is going on at the moment is around children's rights and the extent to which children should be, well, to use a phrase that was used in England, the authors of their own destiny. So there is a big move, rhetorically at least, to actually allow children much more involvement, much more participation, but also access to formal means of redress if they're dissatisfied. And there are big debates about this to do with children's autonomy and what this means for children from different social class backgrounds and with different levels of disability. So the last two big pieces I've worked on with Neville Harris, who's a lawyer from Manchester, have really been focused on this area. And I would just want to flag that up, that I think this is an area, the balance between children's rights, parents' rights and local authority duties, I think is going to be a very big issue for the future, particularly,
Do you mean in relation to appeals?
It's partly to do with appeals. So we have this tribunal system in Scotland, and now children in Scotland are able, with only those with additional support needs, can bring a case to the tribunal. They are the party in the dispute, which is seen as very progressive. The Scottish government says this makes Scotland the most progressive place in Europe. Our research project suggests that, again, there's a gap between the intention and the reality, that very few, children aren't able to do this without massive support.
Yeah.
There are also issues to do with assessment of capacity and social class issues as well. But the Scottish government has just said it's going to incorporate all aspects of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic legislation. So this is a very, very big commitment. And so we're waiting to see what's going to happen next.
And how long ago did you ratify the UN CRPD? You may know Ireland only ratified it in 2018. So we're just coming across these issues, the more kind of rights-based issues. How far did Scotland?
Well, it was actually the UK, that's the state that did the ratification. So it was right at the beginning, actually. So it has been ratified, but it hasn't actually been applied in domestic legislation. So there's been a kind of gap. And I think this implies overhauling all domestic legislation to make the right of the child paramount in all cases. So, well, again, you can imagine that this could be an absolutely massive development. Again, I worry a little bit because it does seem to be placing a massive responsibility on the child. It's a kind of individualization. So rather than saying it's up to us as a society, a collective responsibility, to place that responsibility on individual children could actually be retrograde rather than progressive. But these are debates that we need to have in the future as all these measures are rolled out.
What's the name of the project, just if anybody wants?
Well, the project that I have just finished with Neville Harris is called Autonomy, Rights and Children with Special Educational Needs. A new paradigm, ? So, and I've just written a book about this, which is coming out fairly shortly. So it was actually a comparative study. So a lot of my work has compared what's happening in the different jurisdictions of the UK. This was actually an English-Scottish comparative study because the Scottish legislation goes further than the English legislation. But ironically, England has actually done slightly more, I would say, in terms of trying to make children's rights a reality. Children in England, for example, can't bring their own case to the tribunal, whereas they can in Scotland. And I mean, at the moment in Scotland, there have been very, very few cases where the child has been the party in the dispute, probably less than 10, I